When my cousin Daniel was deployed overseas, our power-hungry HOA president, Laura Benson, saw the perfect opportunity to seize his historic family home. She had been waiting for the right moment, and with him out of the way, she made her move. That morning, I spotted her outside, circling his property like a vulture, phone in hand, documenting what she would later call violations. Laura stood there in her designer workout clothes, tapping away on her screen, the same hands that had approved her husband's construction contracts now recording every tiny detail of Daniel's home. I stepped outside, gripping my coffee as I watched her, knowing something wasn't right. "Excuse me, Laura, what exactly are you doing?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as possible, though my gut told me she wasn't here for anything good. Her fake smile barely masked the satisfaction in her eyes. "Just noting some serious maintenance issues," she replied smoothly, gesturing toward the house. "The paint is at least 2 shades off from the approved HOA color palette, and those hedges," she pointed at the ones Daniel's daughter and I had trimmed every weekend, "are clearly half an inch over regulation height." I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around my cup. "Daniel is literally overseas serving this country, Laura, and this house has been in his family for generations. The previous board approved that paint color 3 years ago." She barely glanced up from her phone. "Rules change," she said casually, "and deployment isn't an excuse for neglecting property values." Then she typed something else into her phone, and my stomach churned. It was the first time I realized that this wasn't about minor HOA rules. It was something bigger, something planned. Over the years, I had watched Laura do this before. The last 3 homeowners who challenged her authority had mysteriously ended up with liens on their properties. Now it was Daniel's turn. That afternoon, I started digging. I combed through every HOA document I could find, flipping through past meeting minutes. And there it was, a proposal buried in last month's notes. A new state-of-the-art community center was set to be built, right in the middle of our street, right where Daniel's house stood. The next week was a blur of certified letters arriving at his doorstep, each one citing a ridiculous new violation. The antique brass knocker, which had survived 2 world wars, was suddenly deemed non-compliant. The rose bushes his daughter had planted before his deployment were now considered invasive species. I tried calling Daniel, but military communications were restricted, and all I could do was send emails, hoping he would receive them in time. More and more board members began driving by the house, slowing down as they passed, jotting notes in their little notebooks. I installed security cameras after I caught Laura's husband measuring the property line at midnight with a flashlight. But the final straw was when I saw Laura leading a group of men in suits on a tour of our street. I followed quietly, heart pounding as I overheard her say, "This entire area will be transformed. The outdated structures will be removed, starting with that one." She pointed directly at Daniel's house. That night, I called his daughter, Emily, who was away at college. "Something's wrong," I told her, keeping my voice low. "I think they're planning something big, and your dad's deployment makes his house an easy target." "But Dad is supposed to be home in 2 weeks," she said, her voice shaking. "They can't just take our house, right?" I wanted to tell her it would be fine, that it was just a misunderstanding, but I knew better. Laura had already survived multiple lawsuits from other homeowners. She knew exactly how to work the system. I hung up the phone, dread settling deep in my bones. Then came the final blow. A certified letter arrived. An emergency HOA meeting had been called for tomorrow night. They were voting on the community center proposal, and the fine print made my blood run cold. The meeting was scheduled exactly 13 days before Daniel's return, 1 day short of the required notice for deployed service members under federal law. Laura had done her homework. She had planned this for months. That night, I locked Daniel's front door, unable to shake the feeling that these might be the last few hours this house would still belong to our family. On the wall, a photo of Daniel receiving his first command caught my eye. He had always told me that battles were won with strategy, not just strength. As I walked home, Laura's porch light snapped on. She stood in her doorway, wrapped in a silk robe, watching me with that same cold, glass-cutting smile. "Better take pictures," she called out sweetly, "for the memories." The night before everything changed, I barely slept. I sat in my living room, the dim glow of my laptop illuminating page after page of legal documents, searching for anything that could stop what was coming. But deep down, I already knew the decision had been made. The HOA had pushed their vote through, and Daniel's home was marked for demolition at sunrise. Outside, the neighborhood was eerily quiet, but I could feel something shifting, like the air was holding its breath. Every so often, I would glance out the window, half expecting to see Laura standing there, watching, waiting. I wasn't far off. At around midnight, I heard the faint sound of voices outside. I moved to the window cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. A small group of people stood near the HOA office across the street, their silhouettes barely visible under the streetlights. Laura was among them, speaking in hushed tones with a few board members and a man in a suit who I didn't recognize. They were shaking hands. My stomach twisted. I already knew what that meant. The final deal had been sealed. I reached for my phone, scrolling through my calls. Still nothing from Daniel. Still no word from his lawyer. I tried calling again, but like every other time, it went straight to voicemail. I gritted my teeth. I couldn't just sit here and do nothing. I had to warn someone. I dialed Emily's number. She answered on the first ring. Did they vote? Her voice was tense, breathless. I hesitated, hating what I had to say. It's done, Emily. They held the meeting early. They pushed it through. She was silent for a long moment. But Dad's supposed to be back in. I know, I cut in. But they planned this. They made sure the demolition would happen before he got back. There was another pause, then a sharp intake of breath. They can't do this. It's illegal. It doesn't matter to them, I said, staring out at the street where Laura and the others were still talking. They know exactly what they're doing. They're counting on the fact that by the time anyone challenges it, the house will already be gone. Emily's voice wavered. All our family pictures are there. My mom's garden. Everything. I closed my eyes. I wanted to promise her that I would stop it, that I would make sure her father's home was still standing when he returned. But I couldn't lie to her. Laura had orchestrated this down to the last minute. She had covered every loophole, ensured that there was no time left to fight back. The HOA had the permits. They had the legal paperwork. They had already paid the demolition crew. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my throat tightening. She sniffed, trying to hold back tears. We have to try something. Anything. I wanted to tell her I would fix it, that I could make it right. But before I could answer, something outside caught my eye. A large truck turned onto our street, its headlights cutting through the night. I stepped closer to the window, my pulse quickening. The truck slowed as it approached Daniel's house. And then another appeared behind it. And another. I felt the air leave my lungs. They were already setting up. The demolition team was here. They weren't even waiting for morning. My hands shook as I grabbed my jacket and ran to the door. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew one thing for sure. Laura had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The sound of heavy machinery shattered the early morning silence, jolting me awake before the sun had even fully risen. My heart pounded as I threw off the blankets and ran to the window, barely able to believe what I was seeing. 3 massive yellow bulldozers rumbled down the street, their engines roaring, their massive claws raised like predatory beasts moving in for the kill. Behind them, a large dump truck followed, ready to collect the remains of what had once been a historic family home. My stomach turned. They weren't waiting for an official go-ahead. They weren't giving us time to fight. They were doing it now. I grabbed the folder of legal documents I had spent the entire night reviewing and sprinted out the door, my bare feet barely registering the cold pavement as I ran toward Daniel's house. The morning fog hadn't even lifted, but there she was, Laura, standing off to the side, her signature smug expression firmly in place, dressed in her usual designer workout gear, as if this was just another day for her. She was tapping away on her iPad, not even looking up as I charged toward her, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Stop!" I yelled, holding up the stack of papers in my hands. "This house belongs to an active duty service member. You can't do this." My voice came out sharper than I expected, a mixture of rage and desperation. Laura finally looked up, her eyes scanning me with a look of mild amusement. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, not even bothering to hide the condescension in her tone. "We had an emergency meeting last night. The board voted unanimously. The demolition is perfectly legal. My hands were shaking as I shoved the papers toward her, but she barely glanced at them. We even have a city inspector's report, she added smoothly, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. The structure was deemed unsafe. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. What inspector? I've been here every single day. Laura smiled, and that's when I saw it, the absolute certainty in her eyes that she had already won. The bulldozer operator hesitated, looking between me and Laura, clearly uncomfortable. I turned to him, pleading, "Please don't do this. The owner is an active-duty soldier. This is his home." The operator shifted his weight, his fingers twitching near the controls. He wasn't heartless, but he wasn't in charge either. My hands clenched around the legal papers as I desperately pulled out my phone. My only hope now was Daniel's lawyer. I hit dial, pacing back and forth as the phone rang, each second feeling like an eternity. Pick up, pick up, pick up. It went straight to voicemail. My pulse roared in my ears as I turned back toward the house. The first bulldozer rolled forward, its massive steel claw hovering over the front porch. The same porch where Daniel and I had sat drinking lemonade on summer afternoons. The same porch where his daughter had learned to read. The same porch where his wife had spent her final days. I opened my mouth to scream, to beg, to do anything, but the sickening crunch of wood splitting apart drowned out everything. The bulldozer had taken its first bite out of Daniel's home. Laura was already on her phone, her voice cool and casual. "Yes, it's starting now. Make sure the crew is ready to break ground for the new community center next week. Don't worry about the permits. I got it all handled." The roar of the machinery swallowed the rest of her words. I stood there, frozen, as I watched my cousin's life being ripped apart in front of me, praying he would make it in time. The roar of the bulldozer was deafening, but then, without warning, it stopped. A strange, uneasy silence settled over the street, as if the entire world had suddenly held its breath. The operator froze, his hand hovering over the controls, his expression shifting from uncertainty to pure dread. I didn't understand why, until I turned and saw him. Daniel had arrived. He stood beside a black SUV, the early morning sunlight reflecting off his sharply pressed military uniform, the insignia on his chest unmistakable. The usually quiet street seemed to shrink under his presence. Every pair of eyes turned toward him, but he didn't react to the attention. He simply stood there, composed, unreadable, his gaze locked onto what remained of his home. Laura, who had been mid-sentence on her phone, suddenly faltered. Her confident smirk wavered for the first time since this nightmare had begun. I watched as she swallowed hard, adjusting her stance like someone realizing too late that they had stepped into a battlefield they weren't prepared for. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't shout. He simply started walking toward the rubble, his polished dress shoes crunching over shattered wood and broken glass. I followed, my breath catching in my throat. I had never seen him like this before, so calm, yet so dangerously quiet. As he approached what used to be his front porch, he knelt down, brushing away debris with a steady hand. And then he found it. Half buried under the wreckage, a small, gold-plated object glinted in the sunlight. His daughter's first ballet trophy. The delicate figurine had snapped in half, its tiny dancer barely clinging to the base. Daniel picked it up with a level of care that made my chest tighten. He didn't move for a long moment, just staring at it, the weight of everything sinking in. The silence stretched on. Even Laura, for all her arrogance, didn't dare speak first. Then finally he stood. He turned to face Laura, his posture as straight and composed as ever, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something cold, something calculating. "Ma'am," he said smoothly, his voice controlled, but with an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. "I believe you're standing on my property." Laura hesitated, gripping the HOA papers in her manicured hands, as if they were a shield. The board's decision was unanimous, general. Everything was handled legally. Daniel held up a single hand, and she fell silent mid-sentence like a soldier caught out of line. Without another word, he reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out his phone. He pressed a single number on speed dial, lifted it to his ear, and waited. The air around us thickened with anticipation. Whoever was on the other end of that call, it was clear that they were about to become Laura's biggest nightmare. Daniel stood motionless, phone pressed to his ear, his expression unreadable as the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Laura shifted uneasily, gripping her clipboard tighter, her confidence flickering like a candle in the wind. The other board members, who had been standing at a distance, started exchanging nervous glances, sensing that whatever was happening wasn't in their favor. Then, Daniel spoke, his voice calm, steady, and carrying the weight of someone who had commanded entire battlefields. "Bill, I think your committee would be very interested in what I'm looking at right now." Laura flinched at the name. The color drained from her face. Even the bulldozer operator, who had been frozen with his hands near the controls, slowly backed away from the machine, as if trying to distance himself from whatever was unfolding. Daniel listened for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Yes, that property. The one my grandfather willed to me. The one that was protected under the Service Members Civil Relief Act." His words landed like hammer blows, each one stripping another layer of Laura's carefully built defense. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. Daniel continued, his voice unwavering. "Yes, Senator Williams, I do believe your office should be involved, and perhaps the local news as well." A low murmur rippled through the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered, their phones now raised, recording every second. Laura's breath hitched audibly. Her polished confidence was gone. In its place was something else, pure, unfiltered panic. She turned sharply, whispering frantically into her own phone, her hands shaking now as she scrolled through her contacts, desperate to reach someone who could undo the mess she had just walked into. But there was no undoing this. Daniel lowered his phone, slipping it back into his pocket with the same measured control he had displayed since arriving. His gaze locked onto Laura, and he took a single step forward. She stepped back. It wasn't a spoken threat. It didn't have to be. The balance of power had shifted entirely. The woman who had bulldozed homes, intimidated residents, and manipulated the system was now the one on unstable ground. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath, trying to convince herself more than anyone else. But Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged. "No, it isn't." His tone was final, unshaken. The real fight had just begun. The moment Daniel put his phone away, the street was no longer just a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a battlefield. Word spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had been silently watching from behind their curtains began stepping outside, phones in hand, whispering among themselves. Within minutes, a local news van pulled up at the end of the block, followed by another. Laura's breath came quicker now, her fingers tapping frantically on her phone screen as she called someone, anyone, to help contain the situation. But it was already spiraling beyond her control. Daniel remained composed, his eyes scanning what was left of his home, but the weight of the destruction settled in his shoulders. He knelt down again, this time lifting a charred photo frame from the rubble. The glass was shattered, the picture inside partially burned, but it was still clear enough to see. His late wife smiling back at him, their daughter barely 5 years old, perched on his shoulders. His grip tightened on the frame, but his face gave nothing away. Laura saw it too, and for a brief moment, she hesitated as if realizing the full extent of what she had done. But she recovered quickly, straightening her back and turning toward the news crews. "This was a simple misunderstanding," she declared loudly, her voice forced and brittle. "The board acted in the best interest of the community. We followed all proper protocols. This was a legal action." The murmurs among the neighbors grew louder. Some nodded, clearly still afraid of crossing the HOA, but others shook their heads, exchanging looks of disbelief. And then a new voice cut through the tension. "That's not what you said last night." The crowd turned as a young woman stepped forward from the sidewalk. It was Sarah Carter, a resident 3 doors down, someone who had always been too afraid to speak up at HOA meetings. She was gripping her phone, so tightly her knuckles were white. "I heard you on the phone, Mrs. Benson," she continued, her voice trembling but determined. "You said the demolition had to be done before he got back. You knew what you were doing." Laura's face went pale, but Sarah wasn't done. She held up her phone. "I recorded everything." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. Even Daniel raised an eyebrow, watching Laura's reaction closely. For the first time since this started, she looked genuinely afraid. Laura's mouth opened and closed as if searching for the right words, but for the first time, nothing came out. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were openly talking, exchanging shocked glances. Some of the HOA board members took a quiet step back, distancing themselves from her, their expressions shifting from arrogance to unease. "That recording is fake," Laura finally blurted, her voice higher than before, her confidence cracking. "This is an attempt to slander the board." But even as she said it, her hands trembled, and everyone could see the panic rising in her eyes. Daniel still hadn't spoken. He was standing just behind Sarah, watching Laura unravel, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to argue. He didn't need to justify himself. He just had to wait, and Laura was doing all the damage on her own. One of the board members, a man named Richard who had always been one of Laura's strongest supporters, cleared his throat and took a cautious step forward. "Maybe we should take a moment to know," Laura snapped, spinning to face him. "We need to handle this before it gets out of control." But it was already too late. The flashing lights of a police cruiser appeared at the end of the block, moving slowly toward the scene. Laura turned, her entire body stiffening as the officers stepped out of the vehicle. One of them, an older officer with sharp eyes, scanned the area before settling his gaze on Daniel. "General," he greeted, his tone respectful, as if he already knew who he was. Daniel gave him a slow nod before finally speaking. "I'd like to file a formal complaint," he said, his voice smooth, unwavering. "Against the HOA, against this woman, and against anyone involved in the illegal demolition of my home. I want charges pressed for fraud, unauthorized destruction of property, and violations under the Service Members Civil Relief Act." A hushed silence fell over the crowd. Laura's breathing turned shallow, her grip tightening on the clipboard she was still holding, as if it could shield her from what was coming next. Daniel's tone didn't change, but the weight of his words was enough to make everyone around them straighten. The officer pulled out a notepad. "Understood, sir. Let's take this inside and go over the details." Laura took a shaky step forward. "There's no need for this," she tried to say, her voice losing its edge. "We can sort this out," but Daniel didn't even look at her. He had already turned, walking toward the police vehicle with the officer, the conversation shifting away from her, as if she no longer mattered. For the first time, she understood what that meant. This wasn't her game anymore. She had just lost control. The police officers moved quickly, their radios crackling as they started collecting statements, flipping through legal documents, and photographing the destruction of Daniel's home. The neighbors, emboldened by Daniel's presence, stepped forward one by one, their voices filled with anger and relief. This wasn't just about one house anymore. Laura had been running the HOA like her own personal empire for years, and now, with cameras rolling and officers taking notes, her world was crumbling. Still, she wasn't ready to let go. She straightened her back, lifting her chin, desperately trying to hold on to the authority that had once commanded fear. "This is all a mistake," she snapped, her voice sharp and forced. "The board agreed to this. The community agreed to this. We followed procedure." But the murmurs around her only grew louder. Someone scoffed. Someone else muttered "liar" under their breath. Laura turned on them, eyes flashing. "You all signed the petitions. You all wanted improvements. Don't act like this wasn't for the benefit of the neighborhood." That was the final straw. One of the board members, Richard, the same man who had been her most loyal supporter just an hour ago, stepped forward, shaking his head. "That's not what happened, Laura." His voice was steady, but the shift in tone was clear. He was done covering for her. "You manipulated us. You pushed votes through without proper notice. You altered HOA records." More voices joined in, former allies now eager to distance themselves from the fallout. "You misused funds. You ignored legal complaints. You threatened homeowners." Laura spun in place, looking at the people she had once controlled, her composure cracking like glass. That's when one of the officers, the one who had spoken to Daniel, stepped forward, holding up a stack of freshly printed documents. "We pulled these from city records," he said, flipping through the pages. "You filed fraudulent property violations to justify this demolition. You also pushed through construction permits without full approval. His voice darkened as he looked up. And you're already under investigation for similar cases in 2 other neighborhoods. The color drained from Laura's face. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. This wasn't just one mistake. This was a pattern, and now it was all catching up to her. Daniel, still standing near the wreckage of his home, didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The law was finally working in his favor, and Laura knew it. One of the officers pulled out a small notepad. We'll be conducting a full investigation, but based on what we've gathered so far, I'd advise you to get legal representation. Laura's breath hitched. For the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. Laura stood frozen, her face pale, her perfectly calculated world unraveling before her eyes. The neighbor she had once ruled over now whispered openly, some recording, others already calling for her removal from the HOA board. The officers continued their work, taking more statements, collecting more evidence. One by one, the remaining board members backed away, some muttering weak excuses about how they had been misled, while others simply walked off, knowing the storm had only just begun. The HOA was crumbling from the inside, and Laura had no allies left. Richard, the board member who had once defended her, turned to an officer. "I'd like to formally resign from the board," he said, his voice tight. "I had no idea the extent of this corruption, and I won't be part of it." He wasn't the only one. Within minutes, 3 more board members followed suit, throwing Laura under the bus to save themselves. She looked around, her breathing shallow, the weight of her downfall crashing down on her. She had spent years manipulating people, twisting the rules, making herself untouchable. But now, all she could do was watch as the very system she had abused finally turned against her. The officer in charge gave a final nod and closed his notepad. "We'll be moving forward with an investigation," he said. "I suggest you prepare yourself for legal proceedings, Mrs. Benson." Laura opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. Daniel, who had remained calm through it all, finally took a step forward. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to threaten her. He simply looked at her, his eyes steady, his posture unwavering. "You thought this was just about a house," he said, his voice dangerously smooth. "But this was about much more than that. You tried to take everything from me, from my family. Now, you get to see what it feels like." The silence that followed was deafening. Laura flinched but said nothing. She knew she had lost. The last shred of her power was gone. A few feet away, neighbors murmured among themselves. Someone mentioned a community vote to remove Laura from the HOA permanently. Someone else whispered about how they should have spoken up sooner. It didn't matter now. The damage was done. Daniel turned away from her without another word, walking toward what remained of his home. The structure was gone, reduced to nothing but rubble. But he wasn't defeated. He had won the real battle. And Laura? She had just made the biggest mistake of her life.